know how governments work. And if we are basically opposing this idea of freedom and spreading the value and the freedom of choice, freedom of protection of value, all these ideas against very powerful institutions. But we have to remember that those institutions are at our service, right? The reason why governments exist is to protect for the common good.
Ask Robert Mugabe.
The problem is that governments forget that, and so do citizens, right? So if we are able to remind our government, every time I go to Washington and talk to a regulator, I very subtly explain to them that I am paying their salary. And Vincent, every public servant is there protecting society because we, with our taxes, pay their salaries. And they are at our service. So, of course, we have to be respectful, we have to be compliant with regulations. All of these things, enactment of laws, public law, private law, is there for a reason. It's there to protect and to organize society. So if you don't forget the basics, so there will be opposition. There's some governments that have more power, they have less concern for human rights and for the choice of citizenships, and they will violate that. And I remember I was able to go to Russia 10 years ago, and now I don't think I would go to Russia today. And because governments change, and political ideas and power struggles emerge, and so that will always be there. But if we don't forget the basics, we are at a point in the evolution of humanity where we have to understand that people have inalienable rights, and that governments are there to serve the people. So we have to work for that.
So Juan, let's take that as a segue to our next topic, which is the status of Bitcoin in the region itself today, and governments, and how. I mean, you showed us a map that shows that the Arab world is basically a dark area. I think two countries, Jordan being one of them, issued a warning on Bitcoin and a ban for any financial institutions to actually use Bitcoin. And beyond that, Lebanon was the first country actually to do it, which added a warning against Bitcoin, which is pretty standard that we're seeing in a lot of countries.
Across the world.
But for mainstream adoption, for regulation, what have you guys been seeing in the region as a whole? Are people asleep to it completely? I always use the story of the Arab world being asleep through the Industrial Revolution and waking up as consumers at the end of the decade, and that obviously had a big toll on our financial system, our economic system, and so forth. So, is the Arab world still asleep? Yes, no. How can we actually gain the adoption of Bitcoin in the Arab world? And what are your plans here, if there are any?
So, it's I would say that the Gulf Cooperative Council countries where I spend most of my time here are maybe a year behind the US and Europe in many ways with this technology. Right now there's no real venture capital-like investment. There's nobody who has a $25 million or $50 million company that's like we have in Silicon Valley where they're doing Bitcoin businesses. There's very, very few Bitcoin businesses. The learning stage is early. This is the first meeting. The first meeting in the US was just a little more than a year ago. And now there's been dozens and dozens, bigger and bigger. Miami was supposed to have 300 people show up, 1,500 people showed up. And there's been, now there's one a month, now there's two a month. And same with Europe. So it's moved very, very, very rapidly. You have thousands of people, they go to these meetings and they leave their jobs. And so it's a year, but a lot happens in a year. So I think this will be a very different place in another 6 months. And as far as governments, I'm cautious about generalizing about this part of the world because there is so many governments in so many different places. They are all different. You have the greater Middle East area. You have sort of the Arab League. You have even just the GCC states, which are 6 states, and then within those kind of some governments. But in general, I think it's early. I don't think it's been hugely on the radar. There's been a couple sort of regionally. I think a lot of the countries that have been here very successful, like the UAE, both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and the things that Saudi Arabia has been successful with as the biggest economy in the region, are usually when they kind of march to their own beat and say, we're going to do it our own way. And I hope that they embrace some of the best things that some countries like the US has done, and also avoid some of the worst things. And what I'm hoping is out of this region that the regulators and the governments will say, oh, wait a minute, what is our moral right to regulate now? Why are we doing this? Why is our position as government, why should we do this? Should we do it because a couple guys in the US say so? What is our moral right? And that goes back to the way governments are run here and the Quran, and there are a lot of things in the Quran about protection of property and assets and people having the right to their own money and their own privacy. And so I'm hoping the governments will say, wait a minute. There are some people on one extreme or the other, but say the most extreme in the US who says, we've got to regulate this because people are doing stuff. But why? What is my moral right if I'm government? What is my moral right to regulate now? Do we really need government to come in there? If I want to give you something and you want to give me something, whether that's math or a poem or a glass of water, is there a moral right? And hopefully, again in a polite way, hopefully the government say, well, wait a minute. Is this our moral right? And also look at the side and say, wait a minute, do we want to be on the wrong side of history? Do we want to be the ones who ban this? And we're the fools of the world who ban it. Hopefully they'll go ahead and say, what I would say if I was talking to any leader in this, I'd say this. Do you really want to get that against Mark Andreessen? Do you think he's wrong? You think Peter Thiel, the Facebook venture capitalist, is wrong? All of these guys who say this is a big deal, why would you want to bet on the wrong side of that? This is an idea, an invention that is here to stay. It's going to happen. I would say get out ahead of it, get out in front of it, and become the most friendly country in the world.
Safely.
Yeah.
Experiment safely also.
Free zone. Say 5-year free zone for Bitcoin, something like that.